The whisper that changed everything. Officer Ethan Carter sat alone in the corner booth of Frank's Diner, his shoulders slumped with exhaustion after a brutal 12-hour shift. The dim glow of the overhead light cast soft shadows on his weathered face as he took a slow sip of his coffee, letting the warmth seep into his bones. The scent of sizzling bacon and fresh toast filled the air, a familiar comfort after a long night on patrol. Despite the late hour, the diner was lively. Truckers hunched over their meals, night shift nurses chatting in the next booth, and an elderly couple sitting quietly by the window, enjoying the kind of peace that only decades of companionship could bring. Ethan exhaled, rubbing his temples. His job wasn't just about catching criminals. It was about witnessing the worst humanity had to offer, day after day. Murders, thefts, domestic violence cases. Sometimes, the weight of it all felt like too much. As he reached for his burger, the bell above the diner door chimed. Instinctively, he glanced up. His eyes fell on a small figure hesitating in the doorway. A young boy, no older than 9, standing there with an air of uncertainty. The child was black, his dark skin contrasting sharply with the pale fluorescent lighting of the diner. He wore a tattered hoodie 2 sizes too big, his sneakers scuffed and barely holding together. His face was gaunt, his wide eyes darting across the room, filled with something Ethan recognized immediately. Fear. Ethan straightened, his cop instincts kicking in. The boy wasn't just lost or looking for food. Something was wrong. The child scanned the diner until his gaze landed on Ethan's uniform. For a second, relief flickered across his face, quickly replaced by hesitation. Then, as if making up his mind, he stepped forward, his small hands clenched into fists. Ethan watched, his heartbeat quickening as the boy approached. "Hey there, buddy," Ethan said, keeping his voice calm, reassuring. "You okay?" The boy didn't answer. He looked over his shoulder once, his eyes darting nervously toward the street outside. Then, stepping closer, he leaned in and whispered 2 words. "Help me." Ethan froze. A chill ran down his spine. 2 simple words, yet the weight behind them sent a bolt of adrenaline through his system. The boy's lip trembled as he stared up at Ethan, his eyes pleading. He wasn't playing a game. This was real. Ethan immediately set his coffee down, his mind shifting into high alert. He'd heard those words too many times in his career, and they were never spoken without reason. "Okay," Ethan said gently, keeping his voice steady. "I'm Officer Carter. What's your name?" The boy hesitated, glancing over his shoulder again. His fingers curled tightly around the edge of the table, as if anchoring himself to the moment. "Aaron," he said, barely above a whisper. Ethan nodded. "All right, Aaron. Can you tell me what's wrong?" The boy swallowed hard. "I ran away," he murmured. "From a bad place." Ethan's stomach clenched. "What kind of bad place?" he asked, careful not to push too hard. Aaron licked his lips, his breath coming in short, shaky bursts. "A house," he said. "A big one. With a red door." Ethan's mind raced. Something about the way Aaron said it sent alarms blaring in his head. "How many kids were there?" he asked, his voice steady despite the dread pooling in his gut. Aaron frowned, as if trying to count. 7, maybe 8. His voice dropped even lower. They kept bringing more. But some kids never came back. A cold sweat broke out on the back of Ethan's neck. His grip on the table tightened. This wasn't just a runaway case. This was something far, far worse. A trafficking ring. Ethan kept his expression neutral, though every fiber of his being screamed to act fast. He slowly reached for the radio on his shoulder, keeping his movements casual. "Dispatch," he murmured, lowering his voice. "This is Officer Carter. I need backup at Frank's Diner on West 5th Street. Possible child endangerment situation. Keep it quiet." There was a pause. Then the dispatcher's voice crackled in his earpiece. "Copy that, Officer Carter. Back up en route. ETA 5 minutes. Ethan looked back at Aaron, who was still fidgeting, his small hands gripping the salt shaker on the table like it was a lifeline. "You're safe now," Ethan reassured him. "Nobody's going to hurt you." Aaron's eyes were filled with something Ethan had seen before in victims: hope, fragile and fleeting. Before Ethan could say another word, the bell above the door chimed again. He looked up. A man in a dark hoodie stepped inside. His face was partially obscured by the shadows, but Ethan could see his posture shift slightly, his eyes locking onto Aaron immediately. Aaron inhaled sharply, his fingers gripping Ethan's sleeve in panic. "That's him," he whispered, his voice barely audible. Ethan's pulse skyrocketed. "Who is he?" he asked, already knowing the answer. "The man with the scar," Aaron choked out. "The one who took us." Every muscle in Ethan's body tensed. Slowly, he moved his hand to his holster. The man took a step forward, his eyes narrowing. Ethan knew this was about to go south. Fast. The pieces clicked together in his mind. If this man was here, then they knew Aaron was gone. They were looking for him. And if they were looking for him, Aaron was in more danger than Ethan had realized. "Stay close to me," Ethan whispered, his hand tightening protectively on Aaron's shoulder. Aaron nodded, his small body trembling. The man in the hoodie smirked. Then, in one swift motion, he turned and bolted out the door. Ethan was already on his feet, his chair scraping against the floor. He grabbed his radio. "Suspect fleeing eastbound on West 5th. Dark hoodie, scar on the left cheek. I need backup now." "Copy that, Officer Carter. Units inbound." Ethan turned to Aaron, whose face was pale with terror. "You're coming with me," Ethan said firmly. "We're going to keep you safe." Aaron nodded rapidly, gripping Ethan's hand like his life depended on it. Ethan's heart pounded as he led Aaron toward the exit. Because now, it wasn't just about saving one child. It was about bringing down a monster. And Ethan would stop at nothing to do it. The chase through shadows. Ethan's heart pounded as he bolted out the door of Frank's diner, Aaron's small hand clutching his own. The cold night air hit his face like a slap, but he barely registered it. His eyes locked onto the man in the dark hoodie, already sprinting down the sidewalk, his form a blur beneath the flickering streetlights. "Stay behind me, kid," Ethan ordered, shielding Aaron with his body as he moved toward his patrol car. The suspect weaved through the sparse foot traffic, shoving past a man carrying a takeout bag and nearly knocking over an elderly woman with a cane. The sound of tires screeching in the distance signaled that backup was closing in, but Ethan knew they were still minutes away. Minutes he didn't have. The man glanced over his shoulder, saw Ethan closing in, and veered sharply into an alleyway. Damn it. Ethan yanked open the passenger door and practically shoved Aaron inside. "Lock the doors. Stay down. Do not move until I come back." Aaron nodded rapidly, his small hands trembling as he fumbled with the lock. Ethan slammed the door shut and turned on his heels, sprinting after the suspect. The moment Ethan entered the alley, the darkness swallowed him. Only the faint glow of a flickering neon sign from a rundown convenience store at the end of the alley provided any light. The suspect had a head start. But Ethan had something he didn't: years of experience chasing down criminals in the dead of night. "Stop. Police." Ethan barked, his voice ricocheting off the narrow brick walls. The man didn't stop. Instead, he darted left, jumping over a pile of discarded wooden pallets. Ethan vaulted over them, his boots landing hard on the wet pavement. His muscles screamed in protest, exhaustion from his shift weighing him down, but adrenaline kept him going. Then suddenly, the suspect skidded to a stop. Ethan slowed, immediately on high alert. The man turned to face him, and for the first time, Ethan got a clear look at him under the dim light. A jagged scar ran down the left side of his face, pulling at the skin near his mouth. His dark eyes gleamed with something sinister, something Ethan had seen too many times before: a predator. Ethan reached for his gun. Hands where I can see them." The man smirked. "You should have minded your business, cop." Before Ethan could react, the man reached into his hoodie and pulled something out, a switchblade. Ethan barely had time to move before the suspect lunged. The knife flashed under the dim light, slashing through the space where Ethan's torso had been just seconds before. He twisted to the side, narrowly avoiding the blade, and countered with a hard punch to the man's ribs. The suspect grunted but didn't back down. Instead, he came at Ethan again, swinging wildly. Ethan ducked, stepping in closer before delivering a brutal elbow to the man's jaw. The force sent the suspect stumbling backward, his back slamming into the alley wall. Blood dripped from his split lip, but he still managed to grin. "You have no idea what you're dealing with," he hissed. Ethan leveled his gun at him. "Try me." But before he could demand more information, the suspect did something unexpected. He reached into his pocket, not for a weapon, but for something else, a small silver whistle. He brought it to his lips and blew. No sound came out. But the hair on the back of Ethan's neck stood on end. Then, from the shadows behind the dumpsters, movement. Ethan's gut twisted. A second man emerged from the darkness. Then a third. Both wore dark clothing, their faces obscured by masks. This wasn't just some lone kidnapper running scared. This was organized. This was bigger than he thought. Ethan tightened his grip on his gun. He was outnumbered, and if he didn't act fast, this situation could turn deadly. One of the masked men stepped forward, a steel pipe in his grip. "You should have walked away," the scared man sneered. Ethan's mind raced. He needed to end this. Now, just as the first masked man lunged at him with the pipe, Ethan fired. The gunshot echoed through the alley, and the attacker crumpled, clutching his wounded leg. The second masked man pulled a knife, but before he could get close, the sound of screeching tires filled the air. Squad cars, flashing red and blue lights, bathed the alley in an eerie glow as two police cruisers skidded to a stop at the entrance. "Drop your weapons." The officers spilled out, guns raised, ready for a fight. The scared man's face twisted in fury, but he knew the odds had just shifted against him. Without another word, he turned and bolted into the darkness, disappearing through a side exit. "Go after him," Ethan shouted, but the man was already gone. The two remaining attackers were quickly subdued by the responding officers, their hands zip-tied behind their backs. Ethan stood there, chest heaving, fists clenched. They had captured two, but the leader had escaped, and that meant Aaron was still in danger. By the time Ethan got back to his patrol car, Aaron was curled up in the passenger seat, his arms wrapped tightly around himself. The second he saw Ethan, his eyes filled with tears. "Are they gone?" Ethan crouched beside the car, his heart clenching at the sheer terror in the boy's expression. "They're not going to hurt you," Ethan said, voice gentle but firm. "I won't let them." Aaron sniffled, his fingers twisting in the fabric of his hoodie. "They know I'm gone now." Ethan hesitated before reaching out and placing a steadying hand on Aaron's shoulder. "You're safe with me, Hid. I promise." But deep down, he knew the battle was far from over. The scared man had escaped, and he wouldn't stop looking for Aaron, which meant Ethan had just become the only thing standing between the boy and a nightmare waiting to reclaim him. And he wasn't about to let that happen. Not now. Not ever. The secret's in the shadows. Ethan's grip on the steering wheel tightened as he drove through the quiet streets of the city. The flashing police lights from the alley had long since faded into the distance, but his pulse still pounded in his ears. Aaron sat beside him, curled up in the passenger seat, his small hands gripping his hoodie so tightly that his knuckles had turned white. They needed a safe place, somewhere off the books. The station wasn't an option. If the kidnappers had people on the inside, it could compromise Aaron's safety. Ethan exhaled sharply. He knew only one place that would do. 10 minutes later, Ethan pulled up in front of a modest brick house at the edge of town. It wasn't much, just a small, unassuming home with a porch swing and a flickering porch light. But it was secure. It belonged to his old mentor, retired officer Raymond Ray Thompson. Ethan glanced at Aaron. "Come on, buddy. We're safe here." Aaron hesitated but unbuckled his seatbelt, following Ethan up the creaky steps. Before Ethan could knock, the door swung open, revealing Ray, a tall, grizzled man in his 60s with silver hair and sharp blue eyes that missed nothing. "Carter," Ray said, his voice gravelly. His eyes flicked to Aaron, then back to Ethan. "You look like hell." Ethan sighed. "I need a favor." Ray studied him for a moment before stepping aside. "Come in." Inside, Ray led them into the living room, where a fireplace crackled, filling the space with warmth. The walls were lined with old police memorabilia, framed medals, and stacks of case files, remnants of a career that had spanned 4 decades. Aaron hesitated near the doorway, his eyes darting around, his small frame tense like a cornered animal. "It's okay, kid," Ray said, eyeing him. "I don't bite." Aaron looked up at Ethan, as if seeking reassurance. Ethan nodded. "Ray's a good guy. He helped train me when I was fresh out of the academy." Ray snorted, more like "saved your ass half a dozen times." Despite the tension in the room, Ethan allowed himself a small smirk. Aaron, however, remained silent. Ray's sharp gaze settled on the boy. "What's his story?" Ethan ran a hand through his hair, exhaustion catching up to him. "He ran away from a trafficking ring. I found him in a diner. One of the men who took him, scar on his face, came looking for him. Got away before we could take him down." Ray's face darkened. "That's bad, Carter." "Yeah," Ethan muttered. "I need to keep him off the grid until I figure out who's behind this." Ray nodded slowly, his fingers drumming against the wooden armrest of his chair. "You trust me with this?" "You're the only one I trust," Ethan admitted. Ray grunted. "You really know how to flatter an old man." He turned to Aaron. "Kid, you hungry?" Aaron hesitated, then nodded shyly. Ray pushed himself up with a groan. "All right, I'll make something. Carter, you and I need to talk." Ethan followed Ray into the kitchen while Aaron settled onto the couch. Ray leaned against the counter, crossing his arms. "You're in deep." Ethan exhaled. "Tell me something I don't know." Ray's piercing gaze softened slightly. "You attached to the kid." Ethan hesitated. He wanted to say no, that this was just another case, another victim he was protecting. But the truth was much more complicated. "He reminds me of me," Ethan admitted, his voice quieter than he intended. "Bouncing from one place to another. No stability. No one to fight for him." Ray studied him for a long moment. "Then you better be damn sure you can protect him." Ethan's jaw tightened. "I will." Ray sighed. "All right, I'll keep him here for now. But you need to figure out who's behind this. Fast." Ethan nodded. He already had a plan. An hour later, Ethan sat at Ray's dining table with his laptop open. Aaron was curled up under a blanket, half asleep on the couch. Ethan's fingers flew over the keyboard as he accessed police databases, scanning for any reports related to missing children. He filtered searches by known trafficking cases, by organized crime rings in the area, by any past incidents related to a house with a red door. Then, he found something. His breath caught. A cold case, nearly identical to Aaron's situation. A boy named Daniel Morris had been found wandering the streets 7 years ago, dazed and terrified. He had claimed he had escaped from a house where bad men kept him locked in a basement with other children. Ethan pulled up Daniel's statement, scanning through the details. His description of the house was eerily similar to Aaron's: the long driveway, the red door, the men who took children and never brought them back. But the most chilling part, Daniel had also mentioned a man with a scar on his face. Ethan's pulse quickened. This wasn't a new operation. It had been going on for years. And somehow, they had evaded law enforcement every time. His hands clenched into fists. Not this time. Not with Aaron still in danger. Ethan flipped open his notepad, scrawling down key details. The original case had gone cold due to lack of evidence. Daniel had been placed into foster care, but no follow-ups had ever been made. Which meant that if Ethan could find Daniel now, he might have more answers. The next morning, Ethan stood in front of an old apartment building on the outskirts of town. The place was run down, the paint peeling from the walls, the air thick with the scent of mildew. Daniel Morris lived here now. Ethan knocked on the door. A few seconds passed before it cracked open slightly, revealing a young man in his late teens with tired eyes and messy hair. "Who are you?" the teen asked wearily. "Officer Carter. I need to talk to you about something important." Daniel frowned. "I haven't been in trouble." "I know," Ethan said. "It's about something from your past. The house. The red door." Daniel's expression shifted instantly. Fear, the kind that never really goes away. I don't know what you're talking about," he muttered, stepping back. Ethan caught the door before it could close. "Please, there's another boy. Aaron. He escaped too. He needs your help." At the mention of another victim, Daniel froze. For a long moment, he said nothing. Then, finally, he exhaled shakily. "Come inside." As Ethan stepped into the tiny apartment, he couldn't shake the feeling that he had just uncovered something much bigger than he'd anticipated. The deeper he dug, the clearer it became. The trafficking ring wasn't just active. It was expanding, and Ethan had just become their biggest problem. But as he glanced at Daniel, at the fear still lingering in his eyes, Ethan knew one thing for certain. He wasn't going to let them win. He wasn't going to let them take another child. And he sure as hell wasn't going to let them get Aaron back. Shadows of the past. Ethan sat across from Daniel Morris in the dimly lit apartment, his notepad open but untouched. The tension in the air was thick, weighed down by ghosts neither of them had spoken about yet. Daniel sat stiffly on the battered couch, his knee bouncing with nervous energy. His hands fidgeted, fingers picking at the edge of his faded hoodie. "You're saying another kid escaped?" Daniel's voice was low, wary. Ethan nodded. "Aaron. He's 9. He ran away from a house that sounds exactly like the one you described in your statement 7 years ago." Daniel exhaled sharply, running a hand through his messy dark hair. "I barely remember what I told them back then. They didn't believe me. Said I was confused." Ethan leaned forward. "I believe you." That made Daniel pause. His gaze flicked up, guarded but searching. "They never stopped, did they?" Ethan asked, voice steady but firm. Daniel swallowed hard. "No," he admitted. "They didn't." Silence stretched between them, the weight of his words settling over the room like a thick fog. Ethan glanced at the old case files he brought with him, flipping to Daniel's original statement. "You mentioned a man with a scar back then." Aaron described the same guy. "He's still involved." Daniel's fingers clenched into fists. "I remember him." His voice wavered slightly. "He was the worst one." His breath hitched, and he cut himself off, shaking his head. Ethan waited, giving him time. Daniel inhaled deeply before continuing. "He called himself Bishop. That wasn't his real name, but that's what he went by. He was in charge." Ethan's jaw tightened. He had heard the alias before. Rumors, whispers in the criminal underworld, but no confirmed identity. "He had a system," Daniel continued. "He didn't just grab kids off the street. It was careful. Planned." Ethan's pen hovered over the notepad. "Tell me everything." Daniel hesitated. "If I talk about this, and they find out." His voice cracked slightly, fear creeping back in. Ethan met his gaze. "I won't let them hurt you, or Aaron, but I need to know what we're dealing with." Daniel let out a shaky breath. "They have people on the inside. Cops, judges, maybe even social workers. That's how they kept getting away with it." Ethan's stomach dropped. This wasn't just a trafficking ring. This was corruption at the highest level. I was supposed to be dead, Daniel whispered. That's why I never talked. I played along, let the system bury me, because I knew if I made noise, they'd come back for me. Ethan clenched his fists. They won't touch you. Daniel scoffed bitterly. You don't get it, officer. They don't stop looking. He leaned forward, eyes dark with something old and broken. If they know that kid escaped, if they know you're helping him, they'll come. Ethan already knew that. He had seen the scared man in the alley. He had felt the weight of Aaron's fear. They were already coming. When Ethan pulled up at Ray's house later that night, exhaustion clung to him like a second skin. His mind was still racing through the conversation with Daniel, trying to piece together the bigger picture. He stepped out of his car, the cool night air biting at his skin. The front porch light flickered slightly as he approached, his boots heavy against the wooden steps. Inside, the scent of coffee filled the air. Ray was at the kitchen table, flipping through an old newspaper, a steaming mug in front of him. He glanced up when Ethan entered. You look like hell. Ethan smirked faintly. Feel like it too. Ray's gaze flicked to the hallway. Kids asleep. Ethan exhaled, some of the tension easing from his shoulders. Good. Ray closed the newspaper. You find anything? Ethan sat down across from him. More than I wanted to. He ran a hand through his hair. It's big, Ray. Bigger than I thought. Corruption. Cops, judges, maybe even child services. That's how they've been getting away with it for so long. Ray's face darkened. Dan. There's a guy, Bishop, Ethan continued. He's the one running it. Ray's expression turned grim. I've heard that name before. Ethan's brows furrowed. Where? Ray rubbed a hand over his jaw. Back in the day, when I was still on the force, there were whispers about a trafficking ring operating in the city, a few missing kids here and there. Nothing that ever stuck. But Bishop's name came up a couple times in off-the-record conversations. Nobody ever had solid proof. Ethan leaned back, his mind spinning. This had been going on for decades. Ray studied him for a long moment before speaking. You're attached to this kid. Ethan didn't even try to deny it. Ray sighed, shaking his head. You always had a habit of picking up strays. Ethan smirked tiredly. Guess some things don't change. Ray's gaze turned serious. So what's your next move? Ethan exhaled. I need more than just rumors. I need proof. I need to take this whole Dan operation down. Ray nodded slowly. Then you better be ready for a fight. Ethan's jaw tightened. I am. The next morning, Ethan woke to the sound of quiet footsteps padding across the floor. He opened his eyes to find Aaron standing at the doorway of the guest room, his small frame silhouetted against the hallway light. Ethan sat up. Hey, buddy. You okay? Aaron hesitated. Then he walked over and sat on the edge of the bed, pulling his knees to his chest. You're leaving, aren't you? Aaron's voice was quiet. Ethan's heart clenched. Not for long. Just to work on the case. Aaron's fingers twisted in the fabric of his hoodie. You're coming back. Ethan didn't hesitate. Always. Aaron studied him for a long moment, his big brown eyes filled with something fragile. Nobody ever stays, he admitted softly. Ethan felt something inside him crack. He reached out, placing a hand on Aaron's shoulder. I'm not like them. Aaron's lips trembled. Promise. Ethan met his gaze, his own voice steady. I promise. For a long moment, Aaron didn't say anything. Then, slowly, he scooted closer and leaned against Ethan's side. Ethan didn't move. He just let the boy rest against him, letting the silence speak for itself. Because for the first time in his life, Ethan realized something. This wasn't just about protecting a witness. This was about protecting his son, and he would do whatever it took to keep Aaron safe. No matter what. The battle in the dark. Ethan sat there, feeling the weight of Aaron leaning against him, the boy's small body trembling with exhaustion and fear. His mind raced. He had spent years chasing criminals, putting away men who thought they were untouchable. But this was different. This wasn't just a case, it was personal. He placed a reassuring hand on Aaron's back. "You should get some more sleep, buddy." Aaron hesitated, then nodded. But instead of returning to the guest room, he curled up beside Ethan, resting his head against the officer's arm. Ethan sighed. He had never been the fatherly type. He had always kept people at arm's length, knowing that his job didn't leave much room for personal attachments. But with Aaron, everything was different. After a few minutes, Aaron's breathing evened out, and Ethan carefully slid out of bed, tucking a blanket around him. He needed to move fast. He walked quietly into the living room, where Ray was already up, sipping his morning coffee. Ray glanced at him. "Kids getting attached." "So am I," Ethan admitted. Ray raised an eyebrow. "Not exactly the best idea, Carter." Ethan ran a hand through his hair. "I know, but I can't let him go back into the system. Not after everything he's been through." Ray sighed, setting his mug down. "You planning on making this permanent?" Ethan looked down at the floor. "I don't know, but I do know that he needs me, and right now, that's all that matters." Ray nodded slowly. "Then you better make sure no one can take him away." Ethan glanced out the window. The sky was still dark, the early morning light just beginning to creep over the horizon. "I need to find Bishop," Ethan said. "Fast." Ray leaned back in his chair, rubbing his jaw. "You know that's not gonna be easy. A guy like that. He's got layers of protection. If you go after him without solid evidence, he'll slip right through your fingers." Ethan clenched his fists. "Then I'll get the evidence." Ray studied him for a moment. "You got a plan?" Ethan nodded. "I'm going back to the precinct. Dig through old records, find any connection between Bishop and local law enforcement. If there's corruption in the system, I need to know who I can trust." Ray sighed. "This is dangerous, Carter." "I know." Ray's expression hardened. "Then don't screw it up. The hunt begins." By the time Ethan arrived at the precinct, the station was already bustling with the early morning shift. He made his way straight to his desk, logging into the internal database. He didn't have much time. If Bishop really had cops on his payroll, any digital footprint he left behind could tip them off. He searched through old cases involving missing children, specifically those that had been closed prematurely. It didn't take long for something suspicious to pop up. 3 years ago, a report had been filed by a social worker named Elaine Porter. She had raised concerns about an unusual pattern of children disappearing from foster homes, only for their files to be sealed without explanation. She had even named an officer, Detective Marcus Sloan. Sloan had been with the department for over 15 years. He was well respected, known for handling high-profile cases. But something about him had never sat right with Ethan. He clicked through Sloan's case history. Dozens of missing children reports, many of them closed with little to no investigation. Ethan's gut churned. Sloan was dirty. And if Sloan was involved, then that meant Bishop had a direct line to the police department. Ethan's blood ran cold. Aaron wasn't just in danger. They both were. The meeting with Sloan. Ethan knew he had to play this carefully. If Sloan suspected that he was onto him, he might warn Bishop. He needed to push just enough to see if Sloan cracked, without tipping his own hand. Ethan found Sloan at his desk, casually drinking coffee as he reviewed paperwork. "Carter," Sloan greeted, not bothering to look up. "Heard you got into a little scuffle last night." Ethan sat down across from him. "Yeah, ran into a guy with a scar on his face. Ring any bells?" Sloan's hand stilled for just a fraction of a second before he sipped his coffee again. "Can't say it does," Sloan said smoothly. "Lots of criminals in this city. Scared ones aren't exactly rare." Ethan studied him. "What about the name Bishop?" This time, Sloan's reaction was more noticeable. His jaw tightened ever so slightly before he forced a chuckle. "You're digging into old rumors, Carter," Sloan said, shaking his head. Waste of time. Ethan leaned forward, lowering his voice. A kid escaped. He told me everything. About the house. The red door. About Bishop. Sloan's face remained neutral, but Ethan could see the flicker of tension in his eyes. You sure you want to keep pushing this, Carter? Sloan said, his voice calm but laced with something dark. Some things are better left buried. Ethan's stomach twisted. That was a threat. And that meant Sloan was guilty. Ethan stood. Guess we'll see about that. Sloan watched him go, but Ethan could feel the weight of his gaze long after he had left the room. The attack. Ethan was halfway to his car when his phone buzzed. A blocked number. He hesitated, then answered. Carter. A deep, smooth voice came through the line. You should have let this go. Ethan's blood turned to ice. Bishop. You made a mistake, Bishop continued. Taking the boy. He belongs to us. Ethan gritted his teeth. Not anymore. A low chuckle. That's what you think. Then the line went dead. Ethan's heart pounded. He turned, scanning the street. That's when he saw them. Two black SUVs parked just down the road. Tinted windows. No plates. A cold realization slammed into him. They weren't going to let him walk away. A door opened. A man in a dark suit stepped out, his expression unreadable. Ethan didn't wait. He bolted. He sprinted toward his car, reaching for his gun, but before he could draw it, he heard the screech of tires behind him. A second SUV roared onto the street, cutting him off. Men poured out, guns drawn. Ethan barely had time to react before the first punch landed against his ribs, knocking the wind out of him. He fought back, throwing a hard elbow into one man's jaw, sending him staggering. He grabbed another by the wrist, twisting the gun from his grasp and slamming him against the hood of a car. But there were too many. A heavy fist crashed into the side of his head, and the world spun. Then, a sharp sting in his neck. A needle. Ethan's vision blurred. His body felt like it was sinking, his limbs growing impossibly heavy. The last thing he heard before darkness took him was Bishop's voice. Game over, Officer Carter. Into the lion's den. Darkness wrapped around Ethan like a suffocating blanket. His head throbbed, his limbs heavy as he drifted between consciousness and oblivion. Distant voices echoed in his ears, muffled and blurred, like a radio playing in another room. His senses flickered, his body sluggish and unresponsive. Then, pain. A sharp, searing sting on his cheek. A slap. Ethan gasped as his eyes snapped open, his body jolting upright. The room spun, nausea rolling through his stomach. His hands were bound behind his back, the rough bite of zip ties digging into his wrists. The metallic taste of blood coated his tongue. He was in a warehouse. The dim overhead light cast long, eerie shadows against the cracked concrete walls. A single wooden chair, his chair, sat in the center of the room. The air was thick with dust, the scent of rust and gasoline clinging to the walls. And standing before him was a man he'd been hunting for weeks. Bishop. The scared man loomed over him, his expression unreadable. He wore a dark suit, his fingers tapping against the hilt of a knife strapped to his belt. His scars stretched across his face, twisting into something almost inhuman when he smirked. You just don't know when to quit, do you, Carter? Ethan's head throbbed, but he forced himself to focus. His pulse pounded in his ears, his muscles tense despite the restraints. Where's the kid? Ethan rasped, his throat dry. Bishop chuckled, shaking his head. That's your first question. Not, where am I? Or, what do you want? He crouched slightly, his piercing eyes locking onto Ethan's. That kid isn't yours to save. Ethan gritted his teeth. He's not yours either. Bishop studied him for a moment before nodding slightly. A second man emerged from the shadows. A tall, lean figure with cold, dead eyes. Detective Marcus Sloan. Ethan's stomach churned. Slum grinned. You should have listened when I told you to back off. Ethan's jaw clenched. How deep are you in this, Sloan? Sloan shrugged, rolling his shoulders. Deep enough to know how to make people disappear, just like you. Bishop let out a low hum, rubbing his chin as he paced. See, Carter, I've been doing this for years. And let me tell you, cops like you, the righteous ones, they never last. Ethan didn't flinch. I'm not afraid of you. Bishop smirked. You should be. Without warning, he swung his fist. The impact sent a sharp explosion of pain through Ethan's jaw, his head snapping to the side. Stars burst behind his eyes. Blood dripped from the corner of his mouth, pooling against his lip. Ethan spit onto the ground, glaring up at him. Is that all you got? Bishop's smirk widened. Oh, Carter, you're going to wish it was. Aaron knows something's wrong. Aaron sat at the kitchen table at Ray's house, staring at the untouched plate of eggs in front of him. He wasn't hungry. His stomach twisted uncomfortably, a heavy feeling settling in his chest. Something was wrong. He had woken up expecting to see Ethan at breakfast, but the officer had never come back. Ray had told him Ethan had work to do. But Aaron wasn't stupid. He had spent years learning how to tell when adults were lying to him. And Ray was lying. Aaron glanced at the old man, who was flipping through a newspaper, pretending everything was fine. Where's Ethan? Aaron asked quietly. Ray didn't look up. He'll be back soon. Aaron swallowed hard. No, he won't. Ray finally met his gaze, sighing deeply. Kid, he's in trouble. Aaron's voice was barely above a whisper. I know it. Ray hesitated, his expression unreadable. Aaron clenched his fists. I have to help him. Ray rubbed a hand over his face, muttering something under his breath. Kid, this isn't something you can. Aaron stood up so fast that his chair scraped against the floor. I'm not just gonna sit here and do nothing. His voice wavered. They took me before. They hurt me. And they're gonna hurt him too. Ray watched him for a long moment. Then he cursed. You're too damn smart for your own good, kid. Aaron blinked, surprised. Ray exhaled sharply, rubbing his temples. All right, I'll tell you what I know, but we do this my way. Aaron nodded quickly. Okay. Ray grabbed his phone, scrolling through his messages. Ethan was looking into a guy named Bishop. Real bad news. If I had to guess, he got too close. Aaron's hands clenched into fists. Then we have to get him back. Ray arched an eyebrow. And how do you plan on doing that? Aaron bit his lip, thinking. Then, an idea sparked. They have people on the inside, right? Ray frowned. Yeah. Aaron hesitated. Then maybe we should use someone on the outside. Ray studied him. Go on. Aaron swallowed. Before Ethan found me, I saw something. At the house. Ray's gaze sharpened. What did you see? Aaron took a deep breath. One of the men. He had a tattoo on his wrist. It was numbers. Like a phone number. Ray sat up straighter. You remember it? Aaron nodded. I think so. Ray grabbed a pen and handed it to him. Write it down. Aaron did. Ray stared at the numbers, his jaw tightening. Well, I'll be damned. Aaron frowned. What? Ray stood. This isn't just a random number, kid. This is a burner phone. Aaron tilted his head. A what? Ray smirked slightly. A disposable phone criminals use. It's a direct line to someone in their operation. Aaron's heart pounded. Can we track it? Ray chuckled. Kid, you might have just given us our way in. Aaron straightened. Then let's go get Ethan. Ray grinned. You got guts, kid. I'll give you that. He grabbed his car keys. Come on. We're going hunting. The warehouse standoff. Ethan's head lolled slightly, his breathing heavy. Blood trickled down his temple, his body screaming in pain. But he didn't give Bishop the satisfaction of reacting. Sloan stepped closer, his smirk widening. This is where it ends for you, Carter. Ethan spat blood onto the floor. Go to hell. Bishop chuckled. Not before you. Then, a crash. The warehouse doors burst open. Gunfire erupted. Ethan's head snapped up just in time to see Ray storm in, shotgun raised. And behind him, Aaron. Ethan's stomach dropped. Bishop turned, rage twisting his face. Get the kid. But Aaron wasn't frozen in fear. He reached into his hoodie and pulled out a police-issued taser. Before Bishop could react, Aaron fired. The electric prongs hit Bishop square in the chest. The man convulsed, crashing to the ground with a strangled grunt. Aaron's breath came in short gasps, his small hands gripping the taser tightly. Ethan stared at him, stunned. Ray grinned. Damn kid. You got some nerve. Aaron's lip trembled. Did I do it right? Ethan's chest swelled with pride. You did perfect, buddy. As sirens wailed in the distance, Ethan knew one thing for certain. This kid wasn't just a survivor. He was a fighter. And from now on, Ethan would make sure he never had to fight alone. A family forged in fire. The warehouse was chaos. Sirens wailed in the distance, their high-pitched cries piercing the night as police vehicles roared toward the scene. The red and blue lights flickered across the cold, cracked concrete walls, casting long, jagged shadows. Ethan's breath was ragged as he pushed himself up from the chair, pain radiating through every inch of his body. Blood dripped from the cut on his temple, but he barely noticed. His eyes were locked on Aaron. The boy stood just a few feet away, his small hands still trembling from the taser's recoil. His chest rose and fell in quick, shallow breaths. His eyes, wide with shock, flickered from Bishop's unconscious body to Ethan's battered form. You. Ethan swallowed thickly, stepping forward. You saved my life. Aaron blinked, as if trying to process his own actions. Then, slowly, he nodded. Ray clapped a heavy hand on Aaron's shoulder, a proud grin splitting his weathered face. Kid's got guts, Carter. Hell, he might have more sense than you. Ethan let out a breathless chuckle, shaking his head. Not arguing with that. Bishop groaned on the ground, his body twitching as he struggled to regain control of his muscles. Ethan's expression hardened. He wasn't going to let this bastard walk away. He stepped forward and crouched beside Bishop, gripping the front of his suit and jerking him upright. The scared man's eyes were unfocused, his jaw tightening as he fought against the lingering shock from the taser. You lose, Ethan growled. Bishop chuckled, despite his pain. You think this ends with me? His voice was hoarse, but there was something in his tone that made Ethan's blood run cold. Who else is involved? Ethan demanded. Bishop sneered. You'll never find them. Ethan clenched his teeth. Try me. Before Bishop could respond, the first squad cars screeched to a halt outside. Officers poured into the warehouse, weapons drawn, barking orders. Within seconds, Bishop and Sloan were both restrained, their wrists locked in handcuffs. Ethan exhaled, finally allowing himself to feel the exhaustion weighing him down. It was over. Or at least, this part of it was. Aftermath at the precinct. The police station was alive with activity. Officers moved through the halls. Reports were filed. And suspects were processed. Ethan sat in an interrogation room, watching through the two-way mirror as Bishop was dragged into another cell. The weight of the night settled heavily on his shoulders. Ray leaned against the doorway, crossing his arms. You look like hell. Ethan let out a dry laugh. Feel like it too. Ray nodded toward the observation window. You think he'll talk? Ethan exhaled. Bishop's smart. He knows the system. If he talks, it's because he wants something in return. Ray rubbed his jaw. And Sloan? Ethan shook his head. Sloan's just a cog in the machine. If we want to take the whole thing down, we need more than just him. Ray studied him for a moment. You're not letting this go, are you? Ethan leaned back, running a hand over his face. Not until I know every single kid they took is safe. Ray sighed, but there was a glint of pride in his eyes. Damn fool with a hero complex. Ethan smirked. You taught me everything I know. Ray chuckled. That's what I'm afraid of. His expression turned more serious. Speaking of kids, he's waiting for you. Ethan stiffened. Aaron. Ray nodded toward the door. He hasn't said much. Just sat there, waiting. Ethan swallowed hard, then stood. His body ached, his ribs protesting with every step, but nothing could stop him from heading straight to Aaron. He found the boy sitting on a chair in the break room, his small hands wrapped around a cup of hot chocolate, his feet swinging just above the floor. Aaron looked up as Ethan approached, his eyes searching the officer's face. Ethan knelt beside him, careful to keep his voice gentle. Hey, buddy. Aaron's fingers tightened around the cup. Are you okay? Ethan smiled despite the pain. Yeah, thanks to you. Aaron hesitated, then asked, Are they gone? Ethan's smile faded slightly. We got some of them, but there are still others out there. Aaron's face darkened, his gaze dropping to the cup in his hands. They're gonna come back. Ethan's chest tightened. He hated that this kid had been forced to think like this, to live in constant fear. He reached out, placing a steadying hand on Aaron's shoulder. Not if I can help it. Aaron looked up again, his eyes uncertain. What happens now? Ethan exhaled slowly. This was the question he had been avoiding. Aaron had nowhere to go. No family waiting for him. If he went back into the foster system, there was no telling what would happen. And there was no way in hell Ethan was going to let that happen. I was thinking. Ethan hesitated, rubbing the back of his neck. Maybe you could stay with me. Aaron blinked. For a little while. Ethan took a deep breath. For as long as you want. Aaron stared at him, his expression unreadable. Then, slowly, his eyes filled with something Ethan had never seen in them before. Hope. You mean it? Aaron whispered. Ethan nodded. Yeah, kid. I mean it. A shaky breath escaped Aaron's lips. Then, before Ethan could react, the boy threw his arms around him, hugging him tightly. Ethan froze for a second before wrapping his own arms around Aaron, holding him close. You're safe now, Ethan whispered. I promise. Aaron buried his face in Ethan's shoulder, his small body trembling. Okay. Ethan closed his eyes. For the first time in his life, he wasn't just a cop protecting a victim. He was a father protecting his son, and he would never let anything happen to him again. 1 year later, the sound of laughter filled Ethan's small home. The scent of pancakes drifted through the air as Aaron sat at the kitchen table, flipping through a comic book, his face relaxed in a way Ethan had rarely seen before. You ready for school, buddy? Ethan asked as he set a plate of pancakes in front of Aaron. Aaron grinned. As ready as I'll ever be. Ethan smirked, ruffling the boy's hair. That's my boy. Aaron's smile widened at those words. It had been a long year, court hearings, background checks, endless paperwork. But in the end, it had all been worth it. Because today, Aaron had a home, a family, and a future. As Ethan sat across from Aaron, watching the boy devour his pancakes, he felt something settle deep in his chest. For the first time in his life, he wasn't just fighting against the darkness. He was building something worth protecting. A life, a family, a home. And for the first time, he wasn't alone.